displaying. My name is Sonam Dukta. Um, I, s- I studied linguistics and language pedagogy at SOAS. I did a master's a few years back. I can't remember now. And I also did a bit of Tibetan language teaching at SOAS. Today I'm going to interview Professor Robbie Barnett. He's well-known Tibetan, modern Tibetan historian and expert on current affairs. He started Tibet Information Network TIN in 1988, and also he worked at Columbia University in New York, and now he's associate professor at SOAS and also researcher at King's College London. Welcome and thank you so much for doing the interview with Londonney. And first of all, I'd like to start like your background. If you can tell us about yourself before you started TIN.
Okay, well, to education, education,
Lare.
okay, easier for me. So thank you very much. I'm very honored to be invited to do this interview with you. And of course, I've known you for a long, long time, over many years. And actually, I should thank you for all the help you gave to the late Jamcha Kapchupa in recent years. So thank you very much, Dugda. So yeah, my name is Robbie Barnett. I'm from London, so I was born and brought up here. And my background's a little unorthodox for an academic. I'm not really trained as an academic. I had to learn as I went along because my first experience of Tibetans was when I left school. I worked in India for a year with a very famous English woman who was Anila with the Karmapa, 16th Karmapa, a woman called Frida Bedi, who was quite close to Indira Gandhi and helped in 1959 when the refugees came. So I got to know her after I left school when I was 17, and I taught in a little gompa in northern India, in Dalhousie. It was called Kailash Gompa. And actually I discovered from your previous interview with my colleague Robert Thurman that he taught there as well. And the first thing he did, first contact with Tibetans. So for both of us, we began really as, if you could say, followers of Frida Bedi, Sister Pammo, teaching in the little Lamas homeschool. It was called Young Lamas or Young Tulkus homeschool in Dalhousie. And I think Akon Rinpoche came from there, Tsongpa came from there, Chini Rinpoche. Although they had all left before I went there to teach. So I had some contact with Tibetans in that early year when I was teaching English, when I was 17. And then came back. Actually, it was the monks who persuaded me to come back. I wasn't really planning to, but they said, oh, if you have a chance to go to university, you should. So it was quite interesting that they said that. So I followed their advice and I came back and went to university here in England. I was interested in doing Tibetan at university actually, but there was nobody interested in teaching it.
Oh, I see.
And they would only have done classical anyway. I wanted to do modern. So I kind of let that side go after some time. And I went into theatre. So for about 10 or 15 years, I worked in community theatre, kind of political theatre, you could say, street theatre and so on. And gradually I went into other forms of performance. I was in circus for many years. And then I went into film. I did a number of films and TV and stuff. And one of those circus events invited me to work in Hong Kong in 1987. So I did some shows in Hong Kong. And after I finished the shows, I had some time free because my performing partner left, so I couldn't do more shows. So a friend of mine said, well, you know, when you were young, you 10, 20 years earlier, you used to be interested in Tibet, so why don't you go and visit it? Now, I was in Hong Kong and he said I could go through China. So I did. I went by road through China, hitchhiking, basically, to go to Tibet. My interest then was religious, really. My father had died the year before, and I thought it would be good to go and think about his memory somewhere peaceful. So I had no idea about the politics at all.
Sure.
And when I had been at university, we were all basically supporters of Mao and the Counter-Revolution. Not active supporters, but
Sure.
we would go to plays and see films which said how wonderful the Counter-Revolution was. I hadn't really questioned it.
Yeah.
And I didn't really think about it very much
Okay.
until the moment that the train from Hong Kong arrived in China, that summer of 1987. And I heard the voice of the loudspeaker in the station at Shenzhen as the train arrived, barking instructions to the fellow travelers, passengers and the people in the station. And it immediately seemed to me that I was entering a command state, a state where you get told what to do. It felt like that. Of course, that's just a subjective impression. But it immediately, my whole fantasy about communist China and how equal people were and how women were treated equally and how there was no class, which was a completely outdated idea anyway, it all dissolved. And I spent then several months in China, traveling slowly towards the West, relearning, re-experiencing China, as you could say, in a more realistic, down-to-earth way. It was quite disillusioning, actually. So I had to let go of all those, shall we say, childish, maybe undergraduate, sophomoric fantasies about China.
Okay.
And then I arrived in Tibet on about September, maybe 27th of 1987. I didn't know it, but there was a protest that day. And then I was just recovering from altitude, so I didn't go out much until the third day, fourth day, October 1st. I felt better, and I thought I must go to this temple, this Jokhang temple. I was planning to leave the next day to go, and I wanted to go to Sopu. I'd heard that one could go there and meditate or something like that. And I never got there because there was a big demonstration that day in the square in front of the Jokhang, in front of in the square in front of the police station, which everyone knows about. So I guess that incident changed my path. Ever since then, I started to become interested in.
Did you actually witness the protest while you were in Lhasa?
Yeah, I witnessed it, and I just happened to walk into the square. It had already started because I didn't know what was happening. But an American guy who'd been there from a bit earlier in the morning by chance, he had actually been arrested.
Okay.
And he rushed out of the police station. They let him go because they didn't want to have a Westerner in their hands. And he told me what he'd seen. This was about maybe 10 o'clock in the morning. It had started at about 9 o'clock. And he said inside they're beating the monks. And I remember him describing them beating a monk with a spade or something like that. So I suddenly, I had no idea. I knew nothing about Tibet, really. Or I hadn't been involved with Tibet since I'd been a student. I'd been in the Tibet Society when I was a student, but not really much since then. So suddenly I was in the middle of this demonstration and I had to decide what's my responsibility, ethically, what should I be doing? So I decided I must make sure these Westerners don't get involved in the crowd, because then they'll be photographed and the Chinese will use it as evidence to show provoked by Westerners. Of course, a couple of Westerners did do that. And I think that was a bit unfortunate in terms of that wasn't really the smartest thing to do. But anyway, most of the Westerners, there were other tourists around, they stayed with me and we discussed it and we said, we're going to watch, we're going to witness, we're going to take photographs. And I arranged for people to smuggle the photographs out through someone who didn't have a camera, because we guessed that the police would stop people with cameras and take the film. So we managed to get footage safely out. So I tried to develop this idea that we observe and they see us observing, that will maybe deter them from shooting. Didn't deter, it's deterred them for a while, but not for very long.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always been fascinated by documentary watchers. You sometimes see things which are very scary, well as, where you feel like you need to sometimes intervene because you think that's not right, sort of thing. I'm thinking like the even like the famous, that in the 1980s, the footage of the little Ethiopian famine with the vulture. I'm thinking, if I were the photographer, would I think about taking photographs first or trying to help?
Yeah, yeah.
So I think sometimes, I can imagine you don't want to get involved because you don't want, because China is always kind of like blaming the Western instigators and sort of these kind of things. So I can understand in that sense, you don't want to be involved. But how was kind of like, how close were you to like actual danger or anything
Well,
while in Tibet?
I was closer than I than I intended to be because what happens is you have a demonstration. Maybe I don't know 1,000 Tibetans throwing stones at the police station. And the police are on the roof of the police station because they know, we all knew by then, that there were monks, the 20 or 30 monks who'd started the demonstration around the Balkor had been taken inside the police station. And I think they also knew, as I knew, that they were being beaten up inside. Somebody and so on. So people were trying to get them out of the police station. And that's later why they set the police station front door on fire so that those people could escape. So there was a crowd, and then there was the police across the square, fire engines and paramilitary and things. But at the first, there was no shooting. The police waited and they made announcements and they shouted at people, and they brought in a Tibetan, of course, Tibetan leader to shout at people. He was quite rude, I remember. He was very aggressive, very, they like talking down to people, ordering people to go back. They ignored him, they threw stones at him. And then there was that famous moment when a young kid, I think, grabbed some policemen were chased away, some paramilitary, and they dropped their rifles. And a little boy ran out from the crowd, Tibetan boy, and he kind of broke the rifle and smashed it or something. I don't know how he did it, but he did it. So it was very tense, but there was no shooting. After about, I don't know how long, half an hour, the shooting started. And when I'd never heard shooting before. I'd never heard a gun in my life, really. And so I didn't really believe what it was until I saw puffs of smoke on the brickwork of the Jokung just above our heads. No, we were slightly to the side, myself, but above the people's heads. And then I realized they were shooting. That's what I was hearing. And then everyone tried to run away. I tried to run away as well. And I realized later I ran across the line of fire. I don't know what, I ran towards the other Tibetans where they were going. I ran into the line of fire. So it was kind of dangerous, I realized later. But luckily at that point, maybe they were still firing above our heads. So they started by firing above our heads. That's where I saw the little puffs of dust from the brickwork. And then they fired at people's legs. And then they fired at people, and people got killed and so on. By that time, I had run across the square, and I was able to get down an alleyway and hide. So we had that kind of danger, but that's very short term. Of course, the danger that you experience more is long term, days and days of you're not sure if you're being followed and so on. But basically, it wasn't that dangerous for Westerners, especially at that time. They might throw you out of the country, but and there were a couple of people who had problems in other parts of China, Westerners, but it's quite rare. No, we weren't worried. We weren't frightened. We knew at that time China wasn't really going to take the risk of imprisoning a Westerner. So the danger was always, and still is, am I going to get a Tibetan into danger? Are they going to see me talking to a Tibetan? That's the fear.
So how long afterwards were you in Tibet after that incident?
We stayed quite a while, me and my friend Nick Howan, who I met in the middle of that demonstration.
I see, okay.
An Australian lawyer, human rights lawyer, who later became very senior in Amnesty and then in the UN human rights. So, and he started TIN with me. I saw him and I said, I need your help. I saw him in the crowd when I was running away. We have to get medicine for these people. When I was running away from the shooting, I was standing on the side, I saw Tibetans carry an injured Tibetan who had been shot, clearly, into a little clinic at a, across was outside. And I saw them carry this person in, under gunfire, actually, very brave. And then a few seconds later, they carried him out of that clinic. And I realized they were refusing to treat that person. And later we discovered that's the case, that people would not dare to treat a protester because then they'd be in trouble. And so I had actually treated some Tibetans earlier on my way through China, through Amdo. I had to treat some Tibetan who got in a fight with some PLA men. He won the fight, but he smashed it. You know, he took off his belt. He was a lorry driver. I was hitchhiking, but they took off their belts and they were slashing him with their belt, with the buckles of their belts. They were it's just a fight with Tibetan drivers and soldiers. But he won, but he was quite badly injured. So I'd had him in plenty of medicine, you know, tourists do. So I thought, well, we can use these medicines and I'll collect medicines from other Westerners. And this is where Nick Howen, I first asked him to help me. So we realized that Tibetans couldn't be treated and were in hiding. And then some Tibetans took us to people who'd been wounded. And Nick and I we organized all the Westerners to come together in a hotel. And the other Westerners, other tourists asked me what had happened in the square. And Nick and I explained what we'd seen. And then we asked all those Westerners to go around every tourist hotel and find any doctors. And we found, I think, 2 or 3, who then we would take to treat Tibetans. So we did that for a while, but it got quite risky for those Tibetans because we could have been followed.
And I guess in those days, there weren't many hotels where Westerners are staying, right? So everybody was more or less in the same hotel?
That's right, Bannock Shoal, Snowlands, Kyrie. A couple like that, yeah, so quite close together. So we would meet every night, the Westerners, or those who wanted to help. There would be a lot of people, 50, 40, 60 people would meet every night. And of course they would have people listening, so we would pretend it was someone's birthday and sing happy birthday or something, to try and give some cover, but in a very amateur way. And then we would compile what I would ask other Westerners, what did you see? And I was quite strict. I said, I don't want to hear any rumors. Or you can tell us if it's a rumor, but we can record that as well. But we'll write down what you saw. So then we compiled this document of the different experiences of the various Westerners who had seen the shooting or subsequent events. And then we wrote that up by hand. And I had a team of people from other countries who then translate. It was about 50 pages long. And a team of people translated that into different languages so that there would be better chance of it getting through out of the country. And then people carried it out, that report.
And at that time, did you have any kind of journalistic experience? Because
no, I'd studied literature at university and English literature, so I was, I'm able to write. That's the one thing you learn. And I suddenly realised I was quite useful. And actually, because you can write, you're trained at at least I seem to be trained to write in a plain style. And actually, it's true that's the basis of my work. Really, is can you write in a plain style that's not too polemical, not too emotional. So that was what we did. And I would, we would try to be very plain because we didn't think it would be credible if we were too emotional or sentimental or prejudicial.
And were you guys successful in giving the information to media?
Yeah, actually, the media arrived the day after, I think. They had heard about the little protest on 27th September, which I didn't know about. And they managed to get to Lhasa by the second, or maybe even afternoon of the first. And about 10 or 12 of these big journalists arrived from Beijing. It was kind of unprecedented for there to be a protest in Tibet. And they had no idea about the big protest that happened while they were in the air, really. And they all got thrown out within a day or so. But they met, we met all those people and we gave them copies of what I'd written by then. And they were very impressive, actually. The Beijing press corps, not really like journalists at that time, they were really experts. They really knew China very well. They spoke Chinese fluently, most of them. It was not like now. I think people who go to those postings now, journalists, they may go to many different countries. They're not specialists. But that generation of China journalists, Beijing Press Corps, were extremely high quality, I think, generally speaking.
Okay.
So we were able to communicate. And then other people took out copies. We made these copies, and some took them out to Dharamsala, gave, I think, one to His Holiness.
Okay.
And I think one went to Amnesty. There was one guy, Swedish guy maybe, Swedish woman, I think, who was in one of the hotels, and she said, I didn't know what Amnesty was, but she explained and said, we should, she said, I had no idea, I'd never thought of it. She said, get the names of people who are arrested.
Okay.
So then Nick Howan went to Drepung. He was with maybe Ron Schwartz, who was there. He was helping me. His Tibetan was much better than mine. I didn't remember really much at all. They went to Drepung, and that's where they discovered the names of the people who had been detained there. And then we were able to started collecting names as well as eyewitness reports.
And I guess the famous kind of like the scenes, photos, and the videos were shot by tourists from the, you know, the demonstration in Lhasa at that time.
No videos at that time, I think.
Oh, I thought I saw like maybe it was from afterwards.
Much later in Tin, we got a police video
of
1988. You probably remember that. But I don't think any tourists have videos, or maybe it was all stills. We lost a lot. I mean, a lot disappeared, never turned up.
It would be interesting to see if there was a footage of that little boy breaking the gun.
That's
That
absolutely
would
right.
have been,
Yeah.
that would have been a good photo, I think.
And John Ackerley was among the tourists. Well, he wasn't exactly a tourist. He was there on a mission, I guess. But he took photos, and he and his friend Blake Kerr, they had some photos that became quite well known of the monk Jumper Tenzing, who'd been really badly burnt when they got him out of the burning police station with his arm raised and stuff. So there were photos there. So my encounter really began with that.
And then how did you and Nicholas Owen start Tin?
Oh, well, that's a good question. We tried to stay several months in Lhasa because we had this vague kind of hope that if Westerners stayed around, and a number of us talked about it, wasn't just us, a number of Westerners were quite concerned. We thought we'd better stay as long as possible because at that time, it's not like now. You know, now China is a major world power. But then we maybe weren't wrong entirely. We thought if we're around, they won't massacre Tibetans or whatever. It'll be a deterrent. So we stayed around, and they were very nervous about dealing with us. So we didn't have any trouble. Well, actually, Nick Howan had trouble. They tried. He went back to Drepung to check the names of the prisoners for our list, and the police tried to catch him. And he was with the monks, and the monks saw the police coming to the police station, coming into the monastery, and they hid him in the toilet, in a toilet in Drepung, until the police had passed, and then they smuggled him out some back way. So he was able to get back to Lhasa, and he came back to me and told us that he was being looked for. So that looked quite serious. He had a big red beard, very easy to spot. So we shaved off his beard, cut his hair. I remember we put beer on his hair because that kind of flattens it or something. I don't remember, to try to disguise. It didn't work. The police, we went out, we kept him in the room for 3 or 4 days, and they were going up and down the street. You could see these plainclothes police going. And then eventually he went out again, and they spotted him immediately. And he had to run into a restaurant and get out the back door. And so then we managed to stay, and then we realized that we couldn't stay any longer because the authorities ended all visas, all foreigners' visas. They said, your visas are up, you have to leave, no more renewals, nothing like that. So we ran out of time, and we had to leave that. That was by December.
Around how many kind of like tourists would you say were in Lhasa at the time? So
good question. You know, I think in our country, shall we say, our loosely formed group, there were incredible people. Some of these tourists were so helpful, so committed, especially like European ones, Scandinavian ones. There were maybe like 50 at least 50. And there were probably another 50 or 100 who were in tour groups or who didn't have any connect. They were in fancy hotels outside, didn't connect with them. They probably had no idea what was happening.
Okay.
And then there was other Westerners who were in our kind of hotels, but they were sort of there to be Buddhists, or they didn't want anything to do with it. So there are a few like that. So maybe 100 altogether at that time, I would guess. Yeah. So we by December, as the snows came in, we had to leave. We had no choice, and we left different ways for Nepal, by road to Nepal.
Okay. And when you were outside, did you feel the information has got out, that there was like a lot of awareness and interest from media to find out a bit more about what's happening and stuff?
Yeah, we of course had no idea or experience. I think I'd never, I don't think I'd ever talked to a journalist before, but they wanted to talk to us, particularly BBC people. Oh, you were there. What did you see? And so on. They had talked to other people who had come out earlier. I think John Ackerley and Blake Kerr. But I guess we had a different. We had people who I was working with in my team. We had a more different approach. More kind of matter of fact, whereas I think we weren't really activists. We were kind of observers, trying to be eyewitnesses. But the journalists were very, very interested. And then so they interviewed people like me, and then I went to meet to Dharamsala, and I was allowed to meet His Holiness, which was the first time and very, very moving experience. Of course, meeting His Holiness is extraordinary because he's like the best of the journalists. He just asks you questions, but really hard questions. And you get this extraordinary experience. Here's this man who is, beyond the stature that anyone else will ever meet in terms of their standing, asking your opinion. So that's what he does. He treats you, doesn't matter who you are, he wants to know your opinion. What did you see? What did you hear? What do you think is going to happen? So suddenly you feel that, well, I'm nobody, I don't know anything, I just happen to be there. But here is the Dalai Lama saying, well, your opinion matters too, you're part of a piece in the jigsaw. So this was very, very moving, very inspiring. But he's really intellectually open, even to us. But then I went back to London and I just continued with my work for a while. But then I started to receive messages from Tibet. So in Tibet, I had already compiled bits of information, basically that I'd been introduced to Gendun Rinchen. Gendun Rinchen.
Okay.
He was a tour guide in Lhasa who had educated from childhood in India. He was at TCV in Missouri, and then he became an engineer, a mechanical engineer in an Indian factory for 10 years. And then his parents asked him to go back in early 87 to Tibet. So and he became a tour guide, a very successful tour guide actually, quite highly regarded, top tour guide of the year or something. Okay. And someone introduced me to him when I was in Lhasa after the shooting, and he brought me information every day. That was incredibly dangerous.
Sure.
But his information, the first time I met him, I said, well, if you want us to pass things, maybe it was his idea, to send things to journalists outside when we leave, then you could give me, bring me information, I'll try to get it out. And he brought me information. I remember the first time he brought it to me, it was written down on a little piece of paper. It was about saying that the Chinese are throwing babies into the Kichu and killing children. And of course I said, well, how do you know this? And he said, I don't know, I just heard it. And I said, they won't believe this. The journalists they won't believe this unless we have some direct source or some evidence. And I suggested to him, we'll separate what we hear from what we see ourselves or what you see yourself. And when you send me something, mark it as either first-hand or second-hand, whatever. And from that day on, for years, every single piece of information with him was divided into first-hand, second-hand, third-hand, source, credibility. and then opinion. It was incredible. And you think, wow, thank God that, you know, we have an engineer who can think in that clear way. Because you could see that was the problem with lots of the sort of activists reporting. It didn't really, these things are mixed together. But Genden Rinchen, these things are clear. And so you can go to a journalist and say, well, this is, I have a witness for this, first hand. Well, this is second hand, this is opinion. Opinion's important too.
Sure.
Emotion's important too. And so he was already supplying me information when I was there that I was taking out. But a few months later, after I reached London and was working in my film work again, I started to receive messages from him.
Okay.
And they were incredibly detailed. And a lot of them were tape recordings of interviews. They came through foreigners, Westerners, tourists, or other people who later became part of TIN, Ron Schwartz, Nick Howard, who went back as tourists and collected them. And suddenly I had this wealth of material. And Sering Shakya and Lamo Shakya, they came to help translate it. And at first we thought, well, we better write this up. And we wrote it up and gave it to what was then the Tibet Support Group, which had just started. And then Sue Burton said, very smart, always indebted to her, she said, you shouldn't put this through a political group. You should do it independently. Don't have it. It will not have credibility if it comes. Very visionary of her. So there, Nick Howard and I started TIN. She was right. We're an independent group. We don't have a political brief. We're just there to put out information and report. And so that's how TIN started in the spring of. And Genden Rinchen was sending materials, and then other tourists would bring us information.
Okay. I feel like this is still one of the big disadvantages in the Tibetan exile, that, you know, even though they get a lot of information from Tibet, they don't know how to get it out into the media or how to get it, because maybe that's the issue, that they're seen as political with their agenda rather than kind of reporting.
That's exactly right. Nobody believes the actual person. It's a very strange thing. You know, and I was very aware when I was first asked by the BBC, you know, what did you see? That really they're asking me because I'm white, I went to a posh university, and I have a middle-class accent. This is what's working for their, it's obviously influencing them. And if I had a Tibetan name or or a working-class accent or something, or dialect, wouldn't have been like that. It might be like better now. You know, now things are changing. Now, you know, hundreds of you have been to university here, and you know the codes. There are all these little codes in language that make journalists and the elite feel more comfortable. But it's true. Very hard for Tibetans to break through that glass window, especially at that time. Less so now. I mean, remember Sering Shakya eventually took years, but later he's much more significant than me. A major academic figure, because he's just so intellectually, you know, as a real intellectual, he's an authority. But that quite rare, took a long time.
But I was also thinking in terms of, like, you know, Gandetashi, you know, he was saying like Gujusum, and, you know, the people who come over from Tibet, they bring so much information and they give it to the Tibetan government in exile, while maybe the Department of International Relations, they can't seems to use the information in a right way, sort of thing. Sometimes maybe it might be better off giving to academics and these to analyze and to I don't know, create a report or things like that. But I don't know.
Yeah, it's true. Well, we all need each other. The academics need TCHRD. We're very dependent on them. We're very dependent on RFA. And Ganden Tashi is a crucial figure, of course, as an analyst and a thinker. But you're right. I suppose the simplest way to look at it at the moment is we're an octopus. We have many, you know, I'm one arm of the octopus, you're another arm. The activist groups are another arm. We sort of seem to all be we all seem to be. Some people will listen to me. Some people will listen to the politicians. Don't listen to people like me. They're not interested, which is fine. Which is good, but they will listen to ICT or the International Tibetan, something like that, or maybe they'll listen to Amnesty or Human Rights Watch. So maybe we need all those channels.
While at 10, a lot of publication on Tibet came out, like education in Tibet, about the Trapchi nuns and this kind of thing. So how were their research, and how did you kind of like, I guess, finance the publications and things? And were they well received with academically and also in the general public or media?
Well, we're a team. We were a team. So it's all about team building, and we had big funding for a few years from an anonymous donor that was fantastic, that gave us one grant, I think, that enabled us to build the team. So maybe 10 people in London, Della knows all of them, and maybe 10 people overseas in the Kathmandu or in Dharamsala. And in that era, so they're just sort of 3 eras of information gathering for the people outside, like us, outside Tibet, about Tibet. There's an era, a Gendun Rinchen era, when people inside Tibet, like Gendun Rinchen, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, are sending incredibly rich information to people like Tin or Dharamsala or other organizations later, RFA. TCHRD and so on. So there you're getting primary information from what are now called citizen journalists, Tibetans who are news gatherers secretly at huge risk, a lot of them, collecting material and sending it out. Now that material is very important. It's not because it's first-hand, it's because it's rich. It includes many different kinds of things. So the kind of things that Gendun Rinchen and people of that era are sending, it's not just human rights things, if someone's arrested or whatever. It's policies, it's policy documents, it's what people are saying, opinions, it's commerce, what's happening in the street, who's here, who's starting new companies. Those people who are in a situation, they have a much wider view. Sure. When we're outside a situation, we think, oh, I want to know about X, but X is only one of many things. So that era lasts from 1987, really, 88, till 1994, 95. Gendun Rinchen's in prison. He manages to get out because of international pressure, and then he escapes to India in 95 or something. Rigzin Chernyi, another great information gatherer, manages to get to India as well. It's impossible for them to continue because security is so strong. So the rich information era collected by Tibetans comes to an end by 94, 95. 97 we get the Panchen Lama's petition that comes to us from another route through China, actually. So then you get a period of a phase of knowledge which is about 15, 20 years, which is driven by escapees, the people who come across the mountains, the Himalayas, who walk across and escape, 2,000 or 3,000 a year, to Nepal and then into India, of whom a quarter are children, a quarter are monks and nuns, and the others are lay people. And among those people are political prisoners who've been released, or people who are. So then, for those 15, 20 years, information about Tibet is based on what those people tell us. And it's mainly then about human rights, what they experienced in prison and so on. So it starts to be, it's quite rich because it's first-hand, but is starting to become more confined to certain kind of topics. And all the journalists go and interview them. So it's getting harder for us to get rich knowledge, knowledge of exactly these other things like education, child welfare, people's views. That's getting a bit harder to get from that method. And then in 2008, the interview method comes to an end because the borders are sealed by the Chinese in the run-up to the Olympics that August. And fewer people can escape, fewer people to interview. So the journalists stopped going to Dharamsala. Our people in Dharamsala, they don't have so much to interview. And so then we have to turn to the third phase, which is essentially open source, what we call open source, you know, reading what the Chinese are saying themselves. So we had always used that, but that was always a backup, you know, what we call triangulation, you know. You hear this report from Tibet and you see something in a newspaper and then you hear it from an interview. But now that's our only method. So this is much slower. You only get positive news in Chinese media, of course, so you have to interpret it this way. Jamche Kapshuba was so invaluable, so important, people like him. And other people who come from Tibet, they can interpret these things better, but it's very hard to verify things. But there is another source of information in this third phase, the open source phase, where there's no interviewees, no escapees really, or very few. And that's what I call anecdotal fragments, little news reports that you can't really back up, you don't know the context. That's what RFA and Dharamsala are getting these days, the last 20 years. Very interesting. There's been a protest here, there's been an arrest there, somebody taken away for writing about his holiness on a phone, or little things. And actually, those come out through the media, Tibetan media essentially, or exile media or something, and they don't get picked up by the major media unless we put them together and put them in a big report for Human Rights Watch, kind of stuff that I do. Sometimes gets picked up, but they're human rights things, and they're only the worst things, you know, because people take incredible risk to send those little fragments out, so they only send the most serious things. So there we're missing the kind of everyday things. The open source material sort of hints at the everyday things, but you never know what they are. So now we have a different kind of problem. We've got quite a lot of these fragments which turn out to be really very high level of accuracy. Of course, people exaggerate the significance or whatever, but the core information's usually right, usually turns out to be right. But we're not getting everyday stuff. So the everyday stuff we try to do open source is quite difficult, takes a long time. But we're gradually getting, you know, learning to find how can we tell what policy is going on. And as you say, we can see now that there really is a crackdown on language issues. And the religion is getting tighter and tighter, those kind of issues too, especially for children. Religious belief for children is being cracked down on. So it's all, the methods we use have to change. In the 90s, we had multiple methods. You could have methods from inside Tibet, you could have some open source, you had SWB then, famous service that the BBC and other people supplied for translation of Chinese open source documents, and you had interviews. You could talk to people. So that's really how we worked in the tin era, combination of those. Now we work in the open source era. I have a team that I work with all the time. We meet twice a week for 3 or 4 hours at a time, and we just go through Chinese news articles. And that's how we discovered, you know, we don't discover much. It's very, very, very slow work. Maybe 3 or 4 times a year we say, I think we can make we can make a judgment from these thousands of articles. That's how we discovered about the Chinese annexation of the north of Bhutan, exactly. You know, it was just by what's on the front page of Tibet Daily, you know, why is some obscure village, why is Wu Yingje, party secretary, visiting this village? Why is it on 3 successive days on the front page of the Daily? No reason given. You know, there must be a reason. Took us a year to find out. Took us a year to find out and another year to check and so on. But and then we discovered there's hundreds of articles about relocation of nomads to, you know, near Lhasa from nomad areas, and they're all voluntary. And you start thinking, well, hundreds of articles. Why are there so many? Why are they continually repeating this? And why do they continually repeat that it's voluntary? Well, maybe it is. We actually think that a lot of the relocation is voluntary. But this particular one, high altitude relocation, a little bit suspicious because the entire village goes. So when you go, I say to Dr. would you like to move to Lhasa? You say yes, could be voluntary, no, perfectly possible. But a whole village? And then we started to do a bit of mathematics. Well, how many of these you know, I don't remember how many I found, maybe 200 articles saying whole village agreed. I also found that in 15%, we made a corpus and analyzed it a little bit. 15% of them, those articles included words that showed Carters had to visit house by house to have heart-to-heart exchanges with the villagers. And so I think that's a bit interesting. Why did they have to visit so many times? And so you explored it. And eventually we found one area in Zayul, I think it's in Zayul, where they had published a Chinese agency that had sent its own staff to Zayul, had sent a Chinese guy, and he had persuaded some village to move. And he was so proud of it, this Chinese guy. He had 3 articles published about how brilliant he was in persuading, you know, encouraging Tibetans to move. And he had a video made by CCTV showing it. They filmed it. Absolute proof that this was basically pressure.
Sure.
So it's not force, you know, but it's really strong pressure. And so then we were able to say, well, look, 50% of articles say heart-to-heart talks. That's quite high. And 100% of people agree. That's a bit odd. And now we have a case in Zayul where it's quite clear that there was extreme pressure placed on one man, one Nakpa in this village who didn't want to go. And it's quite open in the video. And eventually he goes, and you don't, you know, it's very unlikely that he was really happy to go. So you can therefore say this isn't really voluntary. So, but it's a very long process, very long process.
And so after 10, you went to become a modern Tibetan historian at Columbia University. How did that kind of come about? I mean, it's like you're the first kind of modern Tibetan current affairs kind of professor in that sense, right?
Yeah, I had always assumed there would be lots of people who did Tibet current affairs in academia. When I came out of Tibet, I thought, you know, I'd just give my report about what I'd seen and disappear, go back to work. But there weren't other people doing it. There was a Goldstein, I came to hear about him, but he was really, as you say, more history and anthropology, not really current. And it doesn't, a bit different. He obviously did do a book on the negotiations and things, but not really current policies. And Graham Clark, the late Graham Clark, he was quite, you probably don't remember, he died very young. He was doing work on development in Tibet. So there were those 2 people, but very, very few others. And that neither of those people were doing current policies. So I was very surprised. I thought, oh, well. So, and then but really I had no academic training in that at all. I learned a lot from Tsering Shakya. He would just politely correct me and sort of direct me into more academic ways of presenting things and questions to ask. But I wasn't, I remember Tsering Shakya eventually teaching me, you know, all the stuff you're doing on current information, it really, it's like the icing on a cake that is made by historical studies. You know, it is defined by what the world knows about the history of an issue, in this case, history of modern Tibet. And that's why he explained that Tin needed to do not just current affairs, daily reports, which at that time was quite easy to do because Gendon Rinchen was sending this unbelievably rich information in early 90s, and not just him. Other people were sending information to Desum, the office in Dharamsala, and they were sharing things, other people too, and to us. But he explained you need to shape the field so that Westerners know about it by producing primary documents about the history. You know, it means what happened around the time of Chinese invasion, what happened at the time of 1959, what happened later, much later, we realized about Amdo in 1958 and Kama in 1956 and Trishigandro. And so, and then eventually, 1997 maybe, someone came to my house and said, I think I've been given this to give to you. And it was a copy of Panchen Lama's secret petition of 1962, which we had all knew about, everyone knew about it, but no one had ever seen a copy. outside. So then we published that. And then we published a number of other things that were, in a sense, historical. They were historical records. And so we gradually had a kind of academic producing of texts, of primary sources under his guidance, Sering Shakya's guidance, as well as the news. So I don't know whether that's why, but later on, somebody from Columbia contacted me, after 10 years, and said, could you come here and be a visiting scholar? And so I said, yeah, so I went there. And I gave tin up to other people, who to run it. I was very tired by then anyway. And the tin seemed to be, had lots of people. Kate Saunders, Torti Connor had been there. Lots of other people who were running it. It didn't need me, I hoped. And so I went to Columbia. But I wasn't planning to stay.
Okay.
I think I just planned to finish some writing or something. But then I got to Columbia. Well, I should explain one thing, that although under Sering Shakya's guidance, I was getting more interested in academic side, historical, modern history, as well as immediate news, both together. Nobody in any university in Britain basically had the slightest interest in anything Tin was doing, except one woman at SOAS called Shirin Akina, who was a Central Asianist. And Sering had explained to me how to do an academic conference, and I'd done a conference here at SOAS with Shirin Akina as host, the first conference on modern Tibetan studies. That was 1990, and I brought all these Tibetologists, including Goldstein, Tibetologists who'd never done anything modern ever. And they did papers on modern Tibetan studies. So it was fantastic, incredible what those they adapted to modern studies. But they weren't doing modern policy, but some Chinese came too, very, very important, Wang Yao and a couple of others. And so we had done that. But the SOAS China people, I thought, well, this is SOAS, this is Tibet, we should invite the head of China studies to come and give the opening speech. He came. I won't say his name because I hope he would be ashamed to be reminded of this. He came and he gave maybe 2 minutes welcome, saying, welcome to this, I'm not going to stay, Tibet is completely a marginal issue, and left. So those China people were really, this is 1990, they were really part of that, I would say, shocking British attitude that we're being allowed back into China in the post-Mao era. We're not going to mess this up, our access, by talking about Tibet.
But I feel like sadly there's lots still going on, that kind of attitude about
it wasn't going on in America.
And stuff.
It was quite different in America. And it was quite different in Paris, France. They were much more open.
I've noticed that in kind of like the confidence in certain Europe, there's a bit more than in, I guess, UK in sense.
It was disgusting, actually. There were exceptions, of course, a couple of people, but basically after SOAS was not at all interested except for this one professor in Central Asian Studies. So we didn't really develop the academic side until 7 years later or whatever. I went to Columbia, and they said, do something. Can you do something? And I discovered in America nobody was doing modern Tibetan studies then. So I said to Columbia, okay, well, we can start teaching modern Tibetan studies then. So in America, it wasn't like Britain at all. The academics were not frightened, or not most of them, of talking about Tibet, but it wasn't like here. Here was really shameful. But in America, they were very excited about, somebody might start something in a university about modern Tibet. And as Pema Boom, I think, was doing Elliot Sperling. Elliot Sperling was doing stuff mainly anonymously. He was writing for Human Rights Watch about contemporary Tibetan issues, but not with his name very much. But he was becoming more and more involved. So there were people like him, and then rapidly many Americans started emerging who were doing PhDs, who were really outstanding young scholars. So in America, it was much easier to develop this kind of academic side.
I think for us at that time, because we were just kind of like young coming to university and stuff, teen, and this really opened our eyes to what is happening in Tibet. And also, I think, in exile, we had a bit of exile propaganda. And so it was like good to kind of like suddenly change our perception of Tibetan inside Tibet, especially, I mean, like in exile, there was a bit of what do you call it, the propaganda against like Panchen Lama and stuff. And so I think like the book on Panchen Lama, The Broken Arrow, that was like really good in opening our eyes on the good work that he's been doing in Tibet and stuff, in terms of reviving Tibetan language, trying to revive Tibetan kind of pride in themselves, in their culture and things like.
Yeah, it's very interesting, actually. Maybe, I think it would have happened whether people
Yeah,
like
sure.
me were there or not.
Yeah.
You could see a whole development from the sort of, shall we say, the very, the thinking about Tibet that had developed during Cultural Revolution, during Maoist period, when there was really no news from Tibet. Very little direct news because people weren't able to escape and so on. And there were no academics studying Tibet, and the journalists were hopeless. The Westerners just wrote whatever Chinese told them to. They were just China supporters who said China's wonderful. So it's really a quite shocking history, actually, of the West. If you looked at the history of the West through writing about Tibet, it would be really quite disturbing in that period. But it changes as Tibetans become, more Tibetans come from Tibet to India, more Tibetan exiles are traveling, studying more like yourself. The ideas start to change and start to become more mature, more sophisticated. That was happening, wasn't happening because of us.
No,
but we were
also, I think, for us, it's the lack of information as well from Tibetan.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
There was like really like not much kind of interaction between Tibetan inside and outside at that time. I think maybe after the 90s there was a bit more change.
Yeah.
I think that probably the people who came over were maybe very young children who came to study in like Dharamsala and.
When do you remember first meeting people from Tibet?
Mostly when I came to London, sort of thing.
Really?
Yeah, because before I wasn't really sure, like people like Lama Jap and this, and later, of course, our mutual friend late Chamjala, and coming to him, I really wanted to ask, I think you wrote about it in how you first met him at Tibet office, and that must have been like such a interesting, fascinating, and also like a critical kind of moment for Chamjala, whether to stay or to go back.
Yeah.
So how was that kind of like?
It's a very emotional memory, actually, because you see you're present at this turning point in someone's life, and when they have to make a choice that is irrevocable. Once they make that choice, they can't go back, literally. And so I was, I guess, running tin then, but I was also, I didn't get any money from tin.
Sure.
My money was from acting,
Yeah.
doing adverts. I think I was in a theatre show at the time. So I would do theatre in the night and tin in the daytime. So I got this call saying, could I come to the Tibet office immediately? Very rare that they would call me. And so I went to the Tibet office, and actually I was in a play that night. Actually a small theatre in Islington called The King's Head. It was a play about Kafka, actually, quite interestingly. And I remember the play started at 7:30, the performance, so I had to be there by 7, already makeup and so on. And I got the call maybe about 5 o'clock. I got to the Tibet office, maybe 6, and I remember they explained to me, she explained to me, this person I'd introduced me to a person I would later know as Jamshila Kapshiva. He has until 6 p.m. to be back at the embassy. If he isn't back at the embassy by 6 p.m., it's too late. They will know that something's wrong. What do you advise him to do? And he spoke English, of course, wasn't difficult. So I'd never been in that situation before. I mean, we had refugees, people getting asylum, but not defecting from an embassy and not having to make the decision instantly. And so I had to say, well, this decision is irreversible. Once you make the decision, you will be in great danger if you decide to go back. And if you do make the decision to stay, then we can't guarantee that the British government will give you asylum. There's always some risk. It's not certain. But and it depends on, I explained the legal issues, the evidence of persecution. Actually quite complicated in his case, because he was a beneficiary of the system, an elite. So, and it's not as we kind of imagined, in the old days, oh, the British government will give you asylum because you're from the elite. It's not really like that. The courts don't care about that. You have to show persecution. So I had to explain these things. And I had maybe 20 minutes to explain, and he had 20 minutes to decide. And after those 20, 30 minutes, he had to either go back to the embassy.
Was David Burgess like there?
No.
Okay.
I phoned up David Burgess later, and later on, by 6 o'clock, by 5:30, Jamshila said, "I've decided." He had decided. So he had decided for, I'm sure, historical reasons, because of what he felt about his father and his family and people in Tibet, that he owed this to take the risk of staying, which might not work out. And he decided to stay. And then I had to say, okay, now we have to make sure you're hidden, because they might be looking for you after 6. And so I called David Burgess, or called Juden Lamo actually, I think, and said, can you hide someone for a few days? And she said yes immediately. So then we got into their place to hide, which is fantastic. And then we had to move him around a bit, went to Ockenden and so on later on.
So the meeting was just you, Chamjala, and the representative?
Yeah,
at the time, yeah.
I think so. And I was late getting back for the theatre. It was an incredible thing.
So you just had like 20 minutes to...
I think the audience were waiting.
Yeah.
And they had to wait. In theatre terms, if you're a theatre student and you're late for a class 3 times, you're sacked from a theatre school. Okay. It's unheard of for an actor to be late for a show. Never happens. And I was late. And the amazing thing was, maybe 20 minutes late, the audience had to wait 20 minutes. The whole crew, the director, and nobody ever asked me why. Because they all knew that it was something important, that they never questioned it, which I thought was amazing. They trusted, whatever reason I'd had to late, they trusted that was more important than the theatre show. I was very touched by that.
Thank you so much. I think that's a kind of good note to finish on, like to try and look for things which will, on a broader sense, help us understand much more, and which might lead to more serious things, and hopefully it'll be something for the better. We always try to be optimistic in sense, even when the world is a bit strange at the moment.
Yeah.
And so I think I'd like to thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And all your kind of hard work on taking the time to share all your knowledge with us in this short time. Thank you so much.
No, thank you very, very much.
I'd like to offer you the customary Tibetan kata. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you very much. Thank you very much.